Hello, good morning, everybody. I don't have slides. So you can,
Just go forward one.
that's all right.
There you go.
Oh, there I am. Very good. Well, I come to you from the state of Minnesota. How many of you know that Minnesota is the leader in voter turnout in the country? Anybody? Yes, everybody, for sure. So I don't come here to brag, but we have had, so we were the #1 turnout state for over 9 federal elections in a row. We got up to number 6 in 2014, but we're back on top after 2016. But I didn't make this up, somebody else did, but I come to you also with humility because in this country, being the best in voter turnout is kind of like being the prettiest kid in an ugly family. So we're good, we're happy we're #1, but to give you an example of that, in 2010, when we did lead the country in voter turnout, it was about 54–55% of our eligible voters turned out, okay? So even in the best state voter turnout, there's a lot of room to grow. And one of the main points I want to make to add on to the discussion we've had here is we can talk about policy strategies and engagement strategies, and I think we've been talking about both. I want to focus a little bit more on engagement strategies, so I will talk about both. And that's because, you know, kind of that discussion about early voting, does it increase turnout or not? And, you know, I think there's studies that show both, but people decide whether they're going to vote before they decide when, right? Okay, and we have very voter-friendly policies in the state of Minnesota, and yet we see very different turnout based on election types, right? So obviously there's a lot of other factors. Let's take for granted that we need a strong policy environment to facilitate that, but that's not enough, okay? We can have a very good system, but that doesn't make people show up, it just lets people show up, okay? So I do want to talk about 2 policy things that we've experimented with in the city of Minneapolis. The first is called tenant notification of voter registration. What this is an ordinance that we passed in 2015, implemented it in 2016, that requires our landlords to provide voter registration forms to their tenants when they move in. We have in our city over 50% of our residents are renters. So you can imagine there's a lot of registrations that need to occur. People are moving all the time. So what we did, and this was championed by then council member, now our newly elected mayor, Jacob Fry, we first got our landlords together. As you can imagine, they don't want to do anything that they didn't have to do before. We had discussions with them to get buy-in. There was some limited pushback, but we cover the cost of the printing. We just provide them with the materials. Their job is literally, here you go. And what we provide is both a letter from the city that kind of gives the context, here's the elections for this year, and then a registration form on top of that. Now, unfortunately, we don't have good metrics for numbers of how many people are utilizing this and kind of the effectiveness. We're still working out with the county how to track those registrations, things like that. But that's one example, especially if you have populations in your city that are highly mobile, to look at, and I'd be happy to talk to you more offline about how we manage that program. A second policy structure that we have is ranked choice voting. How many of you either have ranked choice voting or have talked about ranked choice voting in your cities? Just a couple. And yes, you guys got ranked choice? Yeah.
What's the term?
Yeah, ranked choice voting, also called instant ranked choice, also called instant runoff voting. So this allows you to rank, in Minneapolis at least, up to 3 candidates for office. Okay, and if your top candidate doesn't get 50% plus 1 of the vote, your vote transfers to the next candidate. And if that candidate loses, it goes to your 3rd candidate. So what this allows you to do is vote for the candidate you really want to win, right? Without saying, oh, well, I don't think they really have a chance, so I'm going to vote for somebody I like less, okay? Now, there's a lot of debate about whether ranked choice voting in and of itself increases turnout, and it's hard to isolate that effect to show that empirically. I can tell you we've been doing, this is our 3rd ranked choice voting election we've had in Minneapolis. Our first was in 2009, and we just completed our 3rd one in 2017. And we did have a very strong turnout. Like this year was 42% of our registered voters voted in our municipal election, which for us is very good. And I don't know, a lot of cities are way lower than that in their turnout. My take is, I don't know for sure that ranked choice voting does in and of itself increase turnout, but it can. It can allow a different type of campaign conversation. It can allow People who maybe really wanted that other candidate who wouldn't have voted normally show up. So I don't know if I should take questions now or later, but yeah. Okay, later. Well, sorry. So ranked choice voting, I know that there's been a lot of talk about that in some places. Anybody from Maine? Anybody from Maine? Okay, well, you know, Maine passed this on a statewide level and it's hung up in the courts. So the whole state of Maine may be voting with ranked choice voting for all their elections. So it's something that we've seen more and more of, and you guys must have been one of the, Fair Vote is based, yeah, Fair Vote is an organization that promotes that. So that's kind of two policy things that we've done, but I want to talk now about more engagement strategies. My colleagues have already said this, but to hammer it home, voting is a social behavior, right? We, I think, often think of, you can see like an individual out there deciding like, should I vote or not? It doesn't, it works like that on some level, but it's more like, what religion are you? You know, what does your family do? What's your culture, okay? Because the biggest predictor of whether you vote or not is if your friends and family do, okay? So it's less of an individual decision, of course it is too. It's more of a social decision. So to give you an example of that, you know, campaigns do different tactics to increase turnout. One tactic that has been popular in recent years is to send a letter to the voters you want to vote, a postcard or a letter. And on that letter, they'll have your voting record and the voting record of your neighbor. Not who you vote for, of course, but if you voted. How many of you have seen these show up in your community? They've been spreading more. So you get a letter that says, hey Jeff, you know, thanks for voting in 2014. You know, your mayor, or your neighbor has been voting, you know, in their local elections, and they voted for all these elections. We hope to see you vote this fall. This makes people furious, okay? And it works. It gets people to show up. I used to work at the Secretary of State's office. We would get phone calls. People were so angry that they got these letters, but it works. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with, you know, why vote, right? That's pure social pressure. And it's one of the strongest interventions, so to speak, that's out there. So for better or worse, the campaign's going to keep doing this because it works. But that's just to illustrate that it's not, you know, we don't need to convince individuals to vote. We need to have a conversation in communities so that people around you all value voting. That's when it's going to really change. So we've done a couple of things kind of in that vein of thinking. One is partnering with community organizations, okay? So how many of you have a food bank in your town, a community health center, right? Some sort of human service provider. Nonprofits can play a really key role in reaching the people that we can't reach otherwise, okay? And nonprofits have a lot of the key assets they need. They have credibility, nonpartisanship, committed staff, and they have access to disengaged voters, right? And they can reach voters that the campaigns won't reach, right? You don't knock on every door. You knock on the doors you need to knock on, right? So who's going to talk to the voters who aren't reached by the campaigns? And it's really the same philosophy as what we've talked about in terms of integrating it into your city work. You don't need to add a staff person to do this stuff. You need the commitment to do it and the leadership and the culture to say this is part of your job. I think that was well said. This voter registration, and it's a small part of your job, but it's a part of your job. So we've had a lot of success working with community organizations to equip them and motivate them to offer this. So they have a client intake process. They add registration to it, okay? And so what we want is wherever people are interacting with institutions, they're getting that message that voting matters. And they can tie it, you know, look, if you know you receive this service, policymakers play a big role in determining whether there's funding for this. You have a self-interest in this. We hope that you'll vote. Another area that we've done as far as engagement is working with youth. In Minnesota, and I know in other states, you can have student election judges, student poll workers. How many of you have states where high school students can serve as poll workers? So we have had a really successful program recruiting poll workers in the schools. And so like in this last election, over 250 high school students served in our polling places. And that's been a key way that we've gotten some key language interpretation skills in the polling place as well. And kind of a third piece of of engagement that I want to talk about was just employee engagement. And we're not doing this in Minneapolis, and I want to. How many of you offer voter registration to your own employees when they come on board? Very good. We don't do that. I think we should. And this is what I counsel kind of nonprofits when they're starting. Start internally with your own people. Start with your board, start with your staff. And, you know, if people internally don't see the value in that or aren't being asked to engage, why should they be engaging other people? So there's lots of things that you can do internally, and then utilizing all of those assets that you already have. What communication vehicles are you already communicating with people in your city? Add a little footer about voter registration. Add a little footer about registration or the upcoming election. If you have utility bill notices, add a stuffer in there that talks about the upcoming election. Property tax notices. Promoting time off work to vote laws. Okay, how many of you internally do that to for your own employees? That's something I think we should do, because there's a lot of laws. I'll tell you, people don't know that you can get time off work to vote in Minnesota. And most states have some sort of law that they vary in whether you can get paid for that time off or not. We have a lot of laws that people aren't taking advantage of or know about. Another example that we can do, and I want to do more of in our city, is educating people about their rights. There's all varying laws, as you know, about if you have a felony conviction, if you can vote. But many people who have a felony conviction, regardless of the law, think that they can't vote. So there's lots of people that could access the system that don't, because they're not even aware of what their current laws and rules are. So that's a pretty big hodgepodge of things that we do. The main thing I want to hammer home is we need to meet people where they're at, which is something that was echoed. You're already seeing your citizens. How can you add voter registration on top of that? And then building some relationships with community partners, okay? Because a lot of the research shows that the messenger is more important than the message. So it's not so much that people need to hear the right words to be convinced, it's that they need to hear it from the right person. And that's really hard. I mean, as policymakers, we want to create this, we create policy, we want to create this system that'll fix all of our problems. And we need to keep addressing the system, but there's a social element to it that I think we can play a role in, you know? And as far as everywhere people go, they're getting this message that voting is for them, and they see people around them doing it. So I'm going to hold things there, wrap up there. I know we got some discussion coming up, so maybe go deeper.